My guest today is the most honored director-producer in the history of the American theater, Harold Prince. He is the recipient of 21 Tony Awards, oh yes, and every other conceivable theater award. As a producer, he has given us such classic musicals as The Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, New Girl in Town, West Side Story, Fiorello, Tenderloin, Flora the Red Menace, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and Fiddler on the Roof. As a director, he has given us the original productions of She Loves Me, It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman, Cabaret, Zorba, Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, On the 20th Century, Sweeney Todd, Evita, Merrily We Roll Along, The Phantom of the Opera, Kiss of a Spider Woman, Parade, and LoveMusik. He also directed the acclaimed revivals of Candide and Show Boat. He is a trustee for the New York Public Library and previously served on the National Council on the Arts for the NEA. Mr. Prince is an officer in the Order of Arts and of Letters from the French government. He is a recipient of a Kennedy Center Honor and a National Medal of the Arts from President Clinton for a career in which he changed the nature of the American musical. He has a brand new book called Sense of Occasion, where he looks back on his illustrious 70-year and counting career. And he is back on Broadway this season at Manhattan Theater Club with the musical that celebrates his glorious career called Prince of Broadway. Please welcome Harold Prince. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sitting with me. You know, I have to tell you, Hal, growing up, my parents took me every year to a Broadway show, and it was always a Harold Prince show.
I don't believe it.
Oh, yes. They told me that I would be entertained to the highest level, and I would learn about something or a subject that I didn't know. So as we start off, I want to thank you for that, sir.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, now, welcome back to Broadway this season with Prince of Broadway. What have you enjoyed the most about working on this show?
Well, I backed into it. I think I better say that right away. I didn't desire to do an advertisement for myself. And I sort of decided a week ago, this is the last occasion that I'm going to do anything like this. I'm a director, and it's uneasy doing advertisements for yourself. But I backed into it because a Canadian impresario asked me to do such a show. And I thought, sure, I'll do it. And then he ducked it because it was too expensive. So now I'd been working on it. And the whole deal was really to illustrate that I think the two sentences that mean the most that are expressed on the stage, one is you can take an audience anywhere, and you can. You don't have to talk down to an audience, and I think there's an awful lot of talking down, a lot of trying to figure out what the formula is that makes a success. As close as I could ever get to that is surprise them. The other sentence in the show that means something to me is something my wife said to me after a number of years being married. She said, "I'm so sick of you saying that Follies was a flop. It was one of the best things you've ever done. It was a success. You've got to distinguish between hit and flop, or box office terms, and success and failure, which is artistic terms." And I so loved that, and I've lived with that in my heart somewhere ever since she said it. And I believe it. I believe it. So though you were mentioning a bunch of shows that were flops, i.e. Pacific Overtures, it was a success as far as I was concerned. It was a very dangerous and adventurous show, and I thought we pulled it off. Did I ever think it would be a success on Broadway? Not really. I know enough about Broadway not to think that. There are certain shows you do that you'll run out of your audience at some point. But your audience can be just, West Side Story ran a year and a half with a break in the middle for 6 months to go to Chicago and come back. The movie was everything. The film was later. People knew what West Side Story was by the time the film was done, and suddenly it was an international success. And now, of course, it's played everywhere, including in opera houses. But not then. That was something new. However, well worth doing. Cabaret, same experience. It ran 3 years. But the film was the best film of the year, as was West Side. And interestingly enough, it became an international film. So I think we sometimes are ahead of of what they do in films and so on. Sometimes film are ahead of us, but it matters what you're doing, and certainly astonishing them, which is a Diaghilev phrase. He said, "Astonish me," is a pretty good standard by which to develop projects for audiences.
Because you have always surrounded yourself with talents that work at the same level as you do, and this show is no exception, Prince of Broadway. What has it been like collaborating with this team and once again with your co-director and choreographer, Susan Stroman?
Well, Stro is endlessly imaginative and terrific, and among the most cheerful collaborators that ever lived. She's just, I'd love to needle her sometime and find out whether there's a temper somewhere. I haven't seen it, and she's a perfect collaborator. Tommy Thompson did the choosing the words selectively, and the set designer, Beowulf Borat, and William Ivy Long did the costumes. They are spectacular. I threw the worst task at them in the world. I said, I want the scenery and the costumes to look as close to the original as possible. And there was a reason for that. Though I don't remember what I staged, and I couldn't possibly dredge up memories. So we did each number and each segment as if it was a brand new piece of material. I spend as much time dealing with scenery and costumes as text. And so I usually put a scenic designer on at the same time we're developing the project. And so I couldn't visit every single one of 17 musicals. We have 17 musicals on that stage, and very often full stage sets. It's a kind of a brilliant job of design. But those designs are familiar to me. And it takes me 6 months to come up with the way a show should look. So I couldn't possibly have done that with 17 shows.
You've assembled a stellar cast of 9. What did you look for when you were casting? Because your cast is flawless in this show.
Yeah, I think so too. I think they're the 9 most talented people I've ever worked with. Now, I've worked with other people equally talented, but these 9 people they do probably on average 3 huge segments in which they are perfectly cast. But if you can find somebody perfectly cast to play Amalia in She Loves Me and Sally Bowles in Cabaret, it's astonishing. And Brianna can do that. And Emily Skinner can do that. They all can do that. That's protean stuff. I can't imagine. It's going to be hell when we take it elsewhere, which we will, hopefully all over the world, and then around the country. It's going to be hell to recast. But there is nobody more talented than the talented people working on Broadway. And that's changed in my lifetime. I've been around long enough to know that there was a time when you had a singing chorus, a dancing chorus, usually 12 or 14 of each, and then leading actors, stars. And the stars were all great personalities who could not sing or dance as well as the chorus people. So the singers came on, and then they left the stage, and the dancers took over, and then they left. And then came West Side Story. And Jerry Robbins insisted that everybody do everything. And that was a huge gift to the theater, but a gift to all those people working in the musical theater, because now they have to sing and dance and act. So 9 people can do what normally 27 at minimum would have to do.
They're brilliant. What I love the most about Prince of Broadway is watching the progression of how you help change and further the face and shape of the American musical theater. Was that one of the goals you had when you were putting the show together?
No.
Or just played out that way? Yeah.
No, I was just trying to express myself. No, what happened really was I hated musicals. I thought musicals were just stupid. And they were. They were musicals when I was a kid, were except for Show Boat and odd exceptions. Porgy and Bess is not really a musical, it's an opera. But they were there when I was a kid. However, most musicals were collections of terrific songs from the Gershwins, from Porter, from Rodgers and Hart, linked together by crazy, silly books. I have 2 examples of that. One is a musical called Something for the Boys with Ethel Merman, Cole Porter score, big hit. And it was during World War II, so the plot was essentially about how Merman got graphite on her teeth and Nazi spies could send messages out through her mouth. And the other one was a show of Rodgers and Hart's that George Abbott directed called Too Many Girls. And Too Many Girls was about a college called Potawatomi. There's actually a place called Potawatomi. I didn't know that till fairly recently in the Middle West. And the girls all wear beanies, signifying that they're virgins. That was something that Desi Arnaz said to somebody else in the show. Why are they wearing beanies? Oh, that's it. So the whole plot turned on the fact that the leading lady, who wore a beanie through the first act, came out in the second act without a beanie. So we know that someone had nailed her. And that was the plot of that huge hit. However, both shows had great scores. Yeah. And that's what musicals did. By the time I was becoming a producer, music was no longer the popular music of theater. Theater music was no longer popular. There was R&B and jazz, rock and roll, big time. And so the popular music was elsewhere. So inadvertently almost, you could address subjects that you could never address before. And Steve Sondheim could write text that could be really advanced character and plot and so on. And that was a new opening for all of us. A fellow who never liked musicals could finally do a musical about a subject that he really was interested in, because it was not a traditional musical subject. So a lot of the shows I did subsequently, first as a producer, certainly West Side, and then as a director, were not normal musical material given the 30s, 40s, and even early 50s.
I love that. I never knew something for the boys. I never realized that. She got graphite on her teeth.
That was that was the plot.
That was the book. Well, you know, let's talk about your book. You also have a brand new book called Sense of Occasion, where you look back and assess your 70-year and counting career.
Actually, I'm lying. It was only about 62 or 4.
Fabulous. With creating some of the most famous landmark musicals. For our audiences, if you love the American musical theater and you want to know how it's done from the greatest director-producer, then you have to get this book. How did you come about writing it, Hal?
Well, it was unfinished business, really. What happened was, when I was a young man, in my late 20s, early 30s, I became a successful producer. And beyond my wildest dreams. And the editor of Harper's Magazine, a very estimable, Harper's and Atlantic are the best, called me and said, you should write a book. And I said, I'm 30 or something. He said, no, you should write a book. So we met and had a lunch, and I said, sure. And then I got chicken, and I didn't write the book. I just kept writing him notes saying, I'm writing the book. And, but then finally, I decided I'd write it. And so in 1974, it came out. It was called Contradictions. And it deals with everything up to 1974, and including 74. I guess it was 73. Anyway, there's a whole lot of shows, many more shows from 74 to now than before. So I thought, you really, you know, it's sort of like you stopped at a little night music or something, and maybe you should set the record straight. Also, it was an opportunity to address what's happened to the theater, because a lot has happened to the theater. The other most important line in Prince of Broadway is when someone says, Follies was the most expensive musical of its time, ever done. It cost $800,000. And the audience, always the wise ones in the audience went, oh. Well, the fact is, you can't do a one-character play, a solo play on Broadway for $800,000. So in the interim years, from 1971 to now, the escalation in cost has been extraordinary. And I don't particularly want to address that, because I think a lot of it is probably due to the fact that no one ever wanted or would want to take a strike, because you can keep these theaters going all the time. And now, of course, we've inherited a new theater where everything runs 15 weeks. When you do a show at Manhattan Theater Club, you know you're good for 12 to 15 weeks. We've just been extended, that's great. But that's it. And that's fine, but you know what you're getting into. Now, of course, you do know what you're getting into. You're a Hollywood star. You go to Broadway for 12 weeks or 14 weeks, and the show closes. And what they think they're doing, the investors, the producers of these shows, because the producers are now the investors. That never was so. I couldn't have put a nickel in Pajama Game. I was making $75 a week as a stage manager, and happy to do so. But now, all these producers are investors. And so they bet on a movie star coming in for 12 to 14 weeks, and that the show will pay off and make a small profit. It's like a guarantee. Well, that has nothing to do with the theater as far as I'm concerned. And I do disapprove of it, actually, because it's cost us something. Too many people now are saying, sure, I'll come to Broadway for 14 weeks, and not even movie stars. And you see, when we did a show, it was not uncommon to sign a cast for a year and a half. Right off the bat, you signed a contract for a year and a half, and you were damn grateful for it. And the likes of Ethel Merman and Mary Martin would take a Broadway show, and if it was a hit, stay with it the length of its run on Broadway, and then go on the road for, so they 4 or 5 years on one show, because Annie Get Your Gun was worth that trouble. And that's not true anymore. You can't get anybody to stay more than a year. And then they're out looking for a show again. It's not advantageous.
But you were a creative producer. Is that something that's lacking?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, there are creative producers, no question, but fewer. And because none of us financed the shows we did. So 2 things. One thing, observation worth making is when I went to theater, and I went to theater more than I go to theater now, I would sit down, and if I looked at the stage and didn't look at the program first, I could tell you who produced that show because of the nature of their taste, you know? And that was very easy. There were Fuhrer Martin shows and Abbott shows, of course, but then there were Theater Guild shows and playwrights shows. And they were not, I mean, Playwrights Horizon, I mean, Playwrights Company. The group of playwrights got together and said, we want to produce our shows. Well, they couldn't have financed them either. So we did backers auditions. Now they do them anyway. They do workshops. We never did a workshop in our lives. And the quality of the shows did not betray that at all. There are 2 things that you might assume, and wrongly. We did a show a year, and some of the shows we did in a year were Company, Follies, Night Music, well, Cabaret. I opened a show with Candide and Ebb that I did not direct called Flora the Red Menace, which turned out to be a disaster, and I sort of knew it when we were in Boston. So I said to the guys the day before the opening on Broadway, will you come to my office tomorrow, the day after the opening, and we'll meet at 10, I have a project. And it was Cabaret. And that opened almost a year to the day. Pajama Game opened in April. Damn Yankees opened almost to the same week a year later. And Rodgers and Hart and Porter and Gershwin's, all those people were used to shows running only a season. That's how much audience there was for a Broadway show. The reason that something like Phantom is running 30 years now is that we get a huge audience from all over the world. Nobody from all over the world ever went to Broadway, and now they do. And it's affected the projects we have. A Phantom, Lion King, those shows are running because you don't have to know the language. You can look at the show, hear the music, and understand the story. And so when we go to Japan, where almost nobody speaks English, at least I haven't, our audiences haven't, you can have Prince of Broadway play sold out for how so many weeks, 6 or something, in a huge theater 3 times the size of the one we're playing now. And the audience loves it. And but not only are we getting them on Broadway, but we're exporting these shows all over the world. So there's a kind of common theater language, which everybody's bought into, thank God. It's terrific. On the other hand, a 30-year run is a 30-year run. I mean, it comes with advantages and disadvantages to the theater. But I couldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. It's just a marvelous thing to happen, and I'm thrilled.
Well, Phantom is going to celebrate its 30th anniversary on Broadway this coming January. Yes.
And there's a good reason for it. We work on it.
Yeah.
Cameron McIntosh's office, the minute a costume is frayed or looks tired, a minute a piece of scenery, it's replaced, tidged up, whatever. The lighting, I'll go into the theater, rarely. Not that I go rarely, but in this occasion, and I'll say, some of the colors gone out of the show, and they'll say, oh boy, you're right, you're a week ahead. They're changing all the colors next week. And so they're constantly doing that. And I'll see the show and rehearse it maybe 4 times a year, which is more than most directors used to do. When I was a producer, I could never get a director like Jerry Robbins or George Abbott ever back into the theater to rehearse a show. Never. And now I think most directors do, because we're getting longer runs and they're grateful.
Well, the great thing about Phantom is if you go back to Phantom of the Opera, it looks like it opened yesterday.
I hope so.
It really does. It looks
That's
like
our intention,
yeah.
God knows. And the minute a performer gets a little tired or bored, we have to replace him. And they get it.
What are you the proudest of with Phantom of the Opera? Is it the jobs that you've given people? What are you the proudest of with Phantom of the Opera?
Well, you're feeding me a piece of information. I'm on to you. When we wanted to do we did Phantom in London, and we wanted to bring it to New York. This is SAG's a union. I'm going to tell an anti-union story right now. Actors Equity, and I like them a lot, and they're terrific and protect their membership. But the Board of Actors Equity refused to let Andrew Lloyd Webber's wife, for whom he wrote the piece, play it on Broadway, because she wasn't, quote, a star. So the Schuberts were desperate. Andrew said, I won't take it to Broadway. And I was desperate. I wanted something. I wanted it on Broadway, God knows. And so a lot of the other creative team. We spent, I think, 4 months, a whole summer, testifying before the board, and they kept saying no. And I kept pointing out the obvious, which is there are almost 40 roles in this show, and only one is there's going to be this English girl who's not a star, and 39 are going to be Equity members. We couldn't get anywhere. Anyway, finally, when they realized that Andrew absolutely would not bend on this, nor should he, we got permission. We did the show. It took 4 months later than we wanted to. And every time we have an anniversary, the 20th, the 25th, and I certainly look forward to saying this on the 30th, I call and ask how many Actors Equity members we've employed in the 3 companies that played, the 4 companies at one point, how many? And there are also Actors Equity members playing in German-speaking countries and various other places. I mean, Schuler Hensley played in, I first saw him as a performer in Hamburg. So, you know, it's enormous. Well, it's way into the last time I said it was like 7,000, but it's more now, certainly, 5 years later. So it's very unrealistic thinking to worry about that particular rule.
Yeah. Your greatest mentor was producer, director, and writer George Abbott. What are some of the greatest lessons you learned from him that you used in your work?
It's a job. Be disciplined. Don't indulge yourself. Get to rehearsal 5 minutes before the rest of the cast. There is no room in the theater for the kind of stuff you do when you see a movie about the theater and people have tantrums and all that stuff. Or there's a marvelous, marvelous picture, which I used in doing Phantom of the Opera, of Callas storming off the stage at the Chicago Lyric in a production of Tosca. And it's wild, it scared the hell out of you. But there's no room for that in the theater, none at all. And the show that I've just done at Manhattan Theater Club is a good illustration of how discipline is important. And all these people know it. And they choose to stay in the theater. They don't choose to go to television. They don't choose to go to Hollywood. And I'm sure some of them could have. A lot of people do, and then find their fortune out there. But these people really are theater people. And I love that about them.
Beautiful. You started producing with the late, great Robert Griffiths. And, you know, when you started producing, there was already a slew of very successful producers working on Broadway. What did you and Robert think that you could do that was different from what other producers were already doing that would make you two stand out?
Well, it started with arrogance. You see, I really was, I really was 24 as a stage manager backstage. Yeah. And we were on Wonderful Town, which is a huge hit with Rosalind Russell in the cast. And I'd stand on the wrong side of the stage because he called the cues and I did it once in a while. And I'd say, well, this is awfully easy what they just did. They got George Abbott to direct a musical. They got Comden and Green and Bernstein to write the show. Why the hell can't we do that? And I whispered that to Bobby Griffith, who was about 30 years older than I don't know exactly what, but plenty. And he'd been a production stage manager all his life. And he said, you really want to do this? I said, yeah. And so one day he called me and he was doing, for Leland Hayward, he was doing the Ford 50th anniversary show. And he said, there's a book review in the Times, read it. If you like it, I can't read it. Do something about it. So I read the book review in the Times. It was a book called 7.5 Cents, which became The Pajama Game. And it was about a strike in a pajama factory. What could make me happier than a strike? You know, I wanted musicals to go to strikes and pajama factories and the Middle West. And so I read it, and that very day, I made an appointment to the agent for the book, Harold Matson, and we went in. I said, Bobby, take a half hour off and we went, it was in Rockefeller Center, and we went to his office, and we said, we want to do this as a musical. And he said, well, I've already had an offer from Leland Hayward and from an offer from elsewhere, because it's that kind of a book. And we said, yes, but what if we gave you George Abbott? And he said, can you? And we said, we'll see. So we went right back, and George Abbott said, sure, I'll do it. And then we started to put a dream team together. Asked Frank Lesser to write the music. He refused. But he said, I have two kids who I think are great. So we hired the two kids, Adler and Ross, and they were great. We asked Jerry Robbins to choreograph, and he said no. Joan McCracken, who was a Abbott favorite dancer, said, my husband's a choreographer. And who is he? Well, his name is Bob Fosse. So, first show. All these people's first show. So it was like that. But then I had some input, if I say so myself, because I'm hipped on this scenery thing. And I thought it has to have the integrity of, well, Oklahoma. So Lem Ayres was a great designer. We got him, and he's one of the hardest designers to get, and we got him. And then we thought, we got to get a book writer. And I thought, let's get Bill Lenge, because he'd written Picnic, and he knew the Middle West. Bill toyed with the idea and then turned us down. So ultimately, we ended up with the author, Richard Bissell, of the book, and George Abbott, who agreed to collaborate with him. Abbott was a great collaborator. And so we took compromises every way, not so much in the Abbott department, but we did, and it all worked out. However, I knew that I was very ambitious, far more than I am today. And I knew that we had to have a hit. First time out, had to have a hit. And now I'm going to answer your question. So we had to not only have a hit, but we had to deal with that hit in a way that separated us off from all the other very successful producers of musicals. And there were a lot of them, few and all over the place. So two things fed into that. In terms of the choreography, I didn't know that Bob Fosse could do it. I just was told by his wife that he could do it, and George Abbott believed his wife. Well, she was right, actually. But I said, do you mind if I ask Jerry Robbins, we'll pay him to just sit on the sidelines in case we need him. And Abbott said, no, of course, you're the producers. So we went to Jerry, and Jerry said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to be a director on Broadway. He had not yet directed. And so I have to have co-directing credit. So I didn't do anything about it. Abbott said one day, whatever happened to Jerry Robbins? I said, oh, well, he passed. He said, really, what happened? And I said, well, he wanted to get co-directing credit. And Abbott said, oh, give it to him. Everybody will know who directed this show. And that's precisely what happened. The other thing that we did, to answer your long-asked question, is we decided to bring a show in for less than anybody ever had, quicker than anybody had in years. So that inspired us to promote a lot of things. We promoted sewing machines. We promoted all the fabrics for the pajamas. We promoted a whole lot of stuff in return for advertising. You could say sleep tight, and so on. And that saved us a lot of money. Then because we were stage managers, we knew when to say no. That's the hardest thing in the world, but we knew what happens backstage, what you can see if you're sitting in the audience. And you see, producers today are backers, so they don't know what to say no about, and very possibly they'll say no when they should have said yes, because it's an artistic decision, because that's what a creative producer can do. So we brought we raised $250,000 to do a show that today would cost 10 to 12 million. We spent 167 for the first show. For Damn Yankees, 162. And the day Pajama Game opened, we by then knew it was going to be a hit. If you were an investor, and we had 175 investors for $250,000, which meant a lot of them were wardrobe mistresses at $500, dressers, stage hands, stage managers from other shows. That's where our money came from. I think the biggest investment was $5,000 from somebody. And anyway, if you were an investor, the morning after the show opened, you read the New York Times review and all the rest of them, and it was a hit. And then you opened your mail, and there was a check for 10% return on your investment. So the word got out very quickly that we were here.
That's great. So up next, you had most of the same team on Damn Yankees, 2 hits in a row.
Yes, almost to the day.
Yeah.
Opened within a week of each other, a year later.
Was it too good to be true, like 2 hits in a row? What went through
No,
your mind?
no, nothing's ever good enough. No, honest to God, I've never celebrated. I really haven't. You just think, oh, it's getting off to a great start, but the bottom will drop out or whatever. No, I've never celebrated much. And certainly, once you do 2, you want to do a third. And the third was a show that wasn't very good called New Girl in Town. It had a great score, but it was a bad idea. It was based on Anna Christie, which should not be a musical. But it paid off. So we had 3. And then we had West Side Story, and then we had Fiorello. So we had 5 shows. So, but then we had a flop. And the flop, after 5 shows, you don't think you'll ever have a flop. And then reality, boing. And you know, you start to realize you're gonna have a lot of flops. And you mentioned a lot of flops, and that's good.
They're my favorite shows. I mean, how many of those flops that we mentioned are your favorite shows, see?
Oh, some are not, believe me. I'm not gonna remind you, but no.
Well, let's get into West Side Story, because West Side Story just celebrated its 60th anniversary. Yep. It opened on September 26, 1957 at the Winter Garden Theater. It was one of those landmark musicals that changed the face of the American musical theater, but I'm sure at the time it was anything but a sure bet. Am I correct with that?
Yeah. Again, I don't know about sure hits. I just said astonish me. And we picked up the show, luckily. It was dropped by Cheryl Crawford, a great producer, creative producer, but she'd done Candide the year before. And it was not well done at all, the original Candide. So her investors were cranky, with reason. And so she thought, I can't raise the money for anything as much like Candide, you know, in terms of seriousness of purpose and so on. So we grabbed it. Well, from the moment we grabbed it, every single time I sat in the rehearsal hall and watched Jerry and watched the cast, or watched a performance in the theater pre-Broadway, I thought, well, this is unprecedented. This is nothing I have ever seen before, which is a good thing, if you can find that.
Did audiences know what to make of the show early on?
No, of course not. And there were always walkouts. There were probably as many as 100 walkouts for a while there. On the other hand, the theater had 1,300 seats, and the other 1,200 were very happy. But there were always 100 that walked out, and it was just too strange for people who had been raised on conventional musicals. But, as I said, it only ran, a year and a half or something on Broadway, but the film happened totally, and every award. You know, when West Side Story opened on Broadway that year, the Tony Award went to The Music Man, and none of the Tony Awards went to West Side except for Dance, which obviously Jerry had to pocket. But that's all. And I remember going to the Tony Awards that year, and I was sat at a table by myself. All the rest of the chairs were empty. They didn't bother to come. I think Jerry came. Maybe 2 of us sat there. Who knows? But it was hard to take. Yeah. And yet, The Music Man is a wonderful show, beautifully written, and with one of the best openings of any show I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah. At what point in your career did you want to direct?
Oh, I always wanted to direct. It's just George Abbott didn't need a director. No, practicality said, I can produce. Let's produce. We can do this, and wait. And I waited. And then at one time, Roger Stevens, who was a great a builder of theater institutions, including the Kennedy Center and Lincoln Center and so on, he asked me to direct Juno, a musical of Juno and the Paycock. And I said to my partner, Bobby, he's offered me this. And Bobby said, oh yeah, let's do it. And I thought, no, there goes my directing career for now, because I know you can't collaborate. I mean, there are great film directors like the Dodon brothers who do make miracles on the screen, but it's hard. So I dropped it for a while. And then a tragic thing happened that freed me, actually. He was playing golf with George Abbott, and he had a heart attack and died. And suddenly there I was. We'd just done a flop called Tenderloin. And I was thinking, what am I going to do now? And I'm losing my right arm. And I went to Europe just to clear my head, where I met my wife in Paris. And I came back to New York, and Abbott said, there's a comedy I have here I'd love to do. You want to produce it? And I said, sure. And with Art Carney and a marvelous cast, and it was a hit. And at the same time, I had picked up a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, and I talked Abbott into directing it. He didn't want to originally. And so we had a hit at the same theater I'm playing at right now. It was called the Biltmore then. And in the spring, I had a funny thing. So I had 2 shows running on Broadway. Very strange and very lucky.
Yeah. Was A Family Affair the first musical you directed?
What happened was I did an interview and saying I wanted to direct. And Family Affair was in, this is the same exact period, 1962. It was in, it'd been directed by Word Baker, who had directed Fantastics and was the choice director at the time. And, but it wasn't working. And so they called Abbott, they called Gower Champion, they called Martin DaCosta, they called all of them, Jerry, and everybody turned them down. So a guy named Richard Seff, who was an agent and an actor subsequently, said to his cousin, who was the producer of Family Affair, I should tell you, interrupt myself by saying Family Affair was music by John Kander and book by the Goldman brothers, Bill and Jim. And so it was a pretty classy group of people, but starting out in their careers. And he said, do you want to come to Philadelphia and see it? So I said, sure. And Abbott said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to go and look at the show, and if I can help it, I'm going to finally direct. And he said, I just want to say one thing to you. Do you think it can be a hit? And I said, no, I don't think it can be a hit. I'm sorry, I called him from Philly and said, I'm going to stay here. And he said, well, what is it? And I said, it's wonderful material. And he said, do you think it's going to be a hit? And I said, no, I don't think it's going to be a hit. He said, remember that. Just remember that and do the best job you can. Because, he said, I'm reputedly the greatest play director that ever was, and I've never made a hit out of a flop. I've just made something, order out of chaos. Good advice. So, of course, I didn't take it. I decided it would be a hit, and I was disappointed. But it got pretty good reviews, and my reputation was out as a young director. And that was the beginning.
Well, how did you come to direct She Loves Me?
Bach and Harnick, who had seen that I was reputedly a director, brought me Fiddler on the Roof, which was then called Tevye the Milkman or Tevye and His Daughters, I don't remember. And I said, it's wonderful, but I can't do this. I don't understand the whole shtetl life. I am Jewish, but I don't understand any of that. My family were German Jews, and I don't get it. And they said, well, we have another musical, like in their other pocket. And I said, so what is it? And they said, well, it's based on a Hungarian play called Parfumerie. It's called She Loves Me. Oh, I got it right away. That I understood. So I did that. And I said, as far as Fiddler is concerned, you need Jerry. And they said, yeah, we know we need Jerry, but he's not available. And I said, well, why don't you wait till he's available? And they did. And then Jerry, they went to Jerry, and Jerry said, I'll do it. This is 1964 now. And he said, but can you get Hal to produce it? So it was wonderful.
I was going to ask you, how has luck been a part of your career? How has it played into
It's
your
everything.
career? Yeah.
I defy you to see anyone who's had a lasting career as an actor, as a performer, chair, as I don't care who. Sidney Lumet did a American Masters or something, and the very first answer he gave was luck. You have to be lucky. There's so many talented people out there who just don't have luck. Now, you have to recognize luck when it's there, and some people avoid it, like the plague, and worry about the wrong things. You shouldn't worry about how much money you're making when you're on a path to something. You shouldn't worry about sharing your dressing room with somebody. You shouldn't worry so much about your billing. You shouldn't. This is mostly about acting, but you shouldn't worry about it. And you have to stay focused on what your goal is. And luck, all the time. Luck in the show that I have at Manhattan Theater Club now. There were other people in it. There were 9 people. There were 5 people who were not in it when we were in Tokyo. Every single one of those 5, and they were very talented, those 5, has been replaced by someone arguably a little better.
Beautifully put. Your musical Cabaret went on to revolutionize the Broadway musical as we know it. But I can only imagine a risky venture. And is this the musical that freed you as a director?
Sure, that's my first success. When I did Cabaret, I thought, I've just done flops for these people. Estimable flops, but flops. Because I was in that hit flop place where I shouldn't have been. And so I thought, this one better be a hit. Well, it was. And a nice big hit. So I was fine from then on.
What unlocked Cabaret for you as a director?
Well, it was a lot of people wanted to do the Sally Bowles story. It was the Berlin stories and endless number of people wanted to do it. And I'd even been brought one by Sandy Wilson, who did The Boyfriend. And it was clever as hell. But it was in the mode of The Boyfriend, a lighthearted entertainment. And we were doing it, Kander and Ebb and I, and Joe Masteroff, who had done She Loves Me. And it was turning out to be a conventional musical for Gwen Verdon to dance on tables, that sort of thing. And suddenly realized that there's nothing that unique about Sally Bowles. It's Breakfast at Tiffany's. Actually, I believe he was influenced by the Berlin stories when he wrote Breakfast. That's Capote. Point is, we had to go somewhere else. And 10 years earlier, whenever, I don't remember how long that was, I'd been in the Army and I'd been sent to Germany. And I tread water for 2 years in the Army. I did nothing to distinguish myself in the Army, I'll tell you. But I did do good weekends off. Because they sent me to Germany. The war was in Korea, but they sent me to Germany. And Germany was my meat. It was the bombed out cities, absolutely everything falling apart. It was like you were in your own movie or musical. And I habituated a little bar in a bombed out church, the cellar of a bombed out church called Maxime's. And there was an MC, actually Joel blew the whistle on himself, at Kennedy Center somewhere, or rather at Lincoln Center. He introduced me and said, I played a dwarf for Hal. And it's true, I've never labeled it a dwarf, but suddenly he said it. And he was a dwarf. He was a dwarf MC, and he had long false eyelashes and red lips and rouge, and he had 3 incredibly opulent, softig chorus girls in butterfly costumes, and they'd circle him, waving their arms and so on. And then he'd take the floor and tell terrible jokes, none of which I understood because, of course, he was speaking German and I didn't. And the bar never had more than 2 sleepy people in it besides me. And I lived there. I thought it was the most marvelous place I'd ever been. First of all, you got to go into a bombed out place and down to the basement. Oh, hell, what could be better? So when we hit a stone wall with Cabaret, I said, there was this MC, and Fred Ebb and John lit up fast, and obviously Joe Mastroff had it right for him. And I said, and I know the fella who can play him. And they said, who? I said, well, I've got a friend named Joel Gray. He can do this. He was born in a trunk. He was Mickey Katz's son, and as a little boy, I've worked with so many people, choreographers, who always show me a picture of themselves with tails and a top hat, and they're about 8 years old, and their fathers drag them onto the stage to perform. And so Joel, there's nothing Joel can't do from that experience. And so he came in, knocked them dead, and they wrote a whole part for him, and we selectively put it through the show, and then it began to emerge that there were 2 worlds, the real world and a limbo world, an unreal world. And if you see the show now at the, anybody seen it yet? Prince of Broadway?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, then you know that she starts singing Cabaret in the cabaret, and then shredded mylar drop falls, and you think, what just happened? I lost the leading lady in the middle of a song. And then her hands go, and she comes through there, and she's left the real world for the limbo world. And she sings the rest of the song about her friend who died. And really, the way that number was designed and worked in the show originally was she's just found out that she's pregnant. And she's agitated beyond belief. And she walks through that curtain into a place which is completely in her own head. And she decides to have an abortion. And that was the trajectory of that number. When they did the movie, Bobby put it at the end of the movie, and Liza Minnelli sang it to death, brilliantly. And but that's not Sally Bowles. In the show, Sally Bowles was modestly gifted. And she couldn't quite sing, couldn't quite dance, but she was a hellion. And that's what we wanted to put on stage. And that's what we did put on stage.
Gorgeous musical. Starting in 1970, you embarked on a collaboration with Stephen Sondheim that produced a series of groundbreaking musicals covering a wide range of subjects and styles that have now gone on to legendary status. Let's start with Company.
Steve sent me, said, I have a friend named George Firth. He's written a bunch of plays, and they want to do 7 of them as one evening. He thinks there's something wrong with that. And I looked at the 7 plays, and I said, well, he's right. Because all I can see is the leading lady changing costumes in the wings. I can't even see the stage for the amount of work she has to do to play 7 characters. And then I said, they were in the office, I said, but there's a musical in 3 of these. What do you mean? Well, 3 of these are really about marriage and the difficulties and the joys and disappointments and the work you have to put into a marriage. And I said, that's interesting. So they bit, and they said, all right, let's do it. And then we sat down and created a character named Bobby, who was not married and who thinks that all his married friends are terrific, but he's free and easy, and comes to realize that he also sees each of these marriages through the eyes that the married couple want him to see. They take out on their friend their grievances with each other as a couple. Then he leaves and they're in love. But he doesn't see that. He doesn't see them together. He sees them as a third corner in the triangle. And so that was Bobby. And then George created other couples. He was an actor, a very successful small part actor in films. And so he wrote for actors. And he wrote for specific actors, and most of those actors played those parts. He'd say, oh, you should know, and you should know. And we did, and we hired them. And Elaine Stritch, he wrote for Elaine Stritch, and brilliantly. So it found its shape, and the guys created that. But we were shooting line, and the one thing that made it all happen was a birthday, Bobby's birthday, which crops up 3 or 4 times in the evening, and they're all gathered, his friends, to celebrate his birthday. And I staged the birthday as if it was underwater, weird. They sang Happy Birthday monotonically, without the melody. And they walked to certain places each time you saw a birthday, but they weren't the same places. They walk in it arbitrarily in a different place. And you knew it wasn't quite like the last birthday. And finally, his final birthday, they're all gathered, and he doesn't come to it. He's gone out on his own to find a life with a partner. And that's the point we made. So it was a very unique show. And again, it ran whatever, a year and a half or 2 years, I think 18 months, something like that. Maybe 21, come to think of it, 21 months. And it was a success, it paid off and so on. But it was certainly unique. And I don't know how many other musicals have actually been shaped that way, I'm not sure.
Well, up next is my all-time favorite musical, Follies. Follies fans? I was 12 years old sitting in the Winter Garden Theater, and I was so emotionally moved in so many ways and entertained and dazzled like never before. Did you go into rehearsals for Follies without the second half of the show written?
Well, yeah, but we knew what Steve had to do, and the Follies section, which emerged out of what preceded it, Steve then delivered it. But the Follies section was delivered during rehearsals and jiggered with later on the road and stuff. But it was a most ingenious way of lifting that show somewhere else. I always thought that the 4 people were essentially engaged in a collective nervous breakdown, and from which 3 of the 4 learn a lesson. But Sally, she goes crazy, and she'll end up in I'm afraid, a cookie jar somewhere, because it's just not. She didn't have the stamina to deal with her lost dream, because everybody has a dream, and most people lose it and adjust to that.
Because you went back to now they do workshops and readings and everything else. A musical today would never go into rehearsal without the second half being written.
No, I'm sure.
You created these incredible shows then.
Yeah, that's true. And and workshops. I've always thought, and it's a flip of me, and I'm sure that's true. It's flip of me. I think I think workshops are a very good reason not to do the show, to spend $200,000 or $300,000 to have everybody come and then turn thumbs down, and then you don't have to do the show. And I've seen that so often.
Yeah.
Of course, you can learn from it, but I think if you have the acumen, you should figure out what you do before. And obviously, in the case of Follies, we certainly knew that Steve could deliver all that material, and so he did, in time.
Yeah. A Little Night Music, another beautiful musical created by you, Stephen Sondheim, Hugh Wheeler, and Patricia Birch. I read where the score came in slowly, and you had gotten to the end of the first act, and I think Steve didn't know where he wanted to go, Mr. Sondheim, and you did something.
Well, I don't know, didn't know where he wanted to go. I think he just wanted a little more help.
Okay.
And so Patty Birch and I staged the end of the first act. Ludicrous, say, oh, look, you just have an invitation to the country. Well, I don't want to go. Well, maybe I should go. Oh, guess what? You have an invitation to the country. Well, really? Oh, I don't know. You know, and so on. One couple after another couple after another couple. And then they all say, all right, let's go. So Steve came in to see the rehearsal, and this pathetic dialogue was handed one to the other. And he went home and wrote A Weekend in the Country. And actually, Patty was able to stage it almost exactly the way it was in this brutal version that we originally showed him.
See, I love that about collaboration, that you can be in a room with all these great people, and what comes out of that is an incredible closing act.
Well, I think so. I don't think, you know, there are so many incredibly talented people out there, and a lot of them will never even get to appreciate. But nobody that's really secure in his talent is sure of anything. You know, you're always frightened, and I think that's the way it is. And yet, this is almost a contradiction, because I like contradictions. Sondheim, I would ask him when he showed me a song. I'd say, I don't know. Do I like that? And he'd say, either, yes, you'll like it. And it would be something like Where You Go in Barcelona, which is just magical, or something where I triggered something, doubts in him. And he'd say, well, Sondheim can rewrite anything. He can write another number. And he never is. It's when you work with collaborators who stick to the wrong material, when you have to suspect that they're fearful they can't write anything else.
Yeah. That's a great bit of advice. That's wonderful. Of all the shows that you've directed, which has been the most difficult or the most challenging for you?
Well, it's going to be a flop, obviously. I love to work, so I've tended to work too much, but I'd rather work too much than too little. I tend to get an idea that a piece of material, a book or a film script or whatever, will say something I want it to say. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes it's really not true, and you're busy twisting and turning. And a good example of that would be Grind, a show for whom really good musical and lyric material was written. But it was a film script that was written and never made. And I read it and I thought, it was Faye Kanan wrote it, and she's a very successful film writer. And I thought, oh, I think this could be made into something which was possessing me at the time, which was could be possessing me again, the proliferation of violence in our society is true right now. God knows this morning it's true. And, but I thought there's just so much violence, domestic violence, violence against strangers, social violence, premeditated, all this stuff. And I thought there's a musical in this. And this was a screenplay, very valid, written about a burlesque house in Chicago where they had equal number of black and white performers. But the blacks and whites never performed on the stage at the same time. On the other hand, off stage, they had a perfectly fine social life. Why I thought, yes, there was an act of violence against the blacks in the show, but why I thought I could twist that and turn it and make it into all these violences, I don't know. It's just self-deception. So that's the hardest. And you twist and you turn and you don't pull it off at all.
Sweeney Todd, when you first read what Stephen Sondheim wanted to do, did you get it right away?
No, I didn't. I thought it was about revenge, obviously, and I've come to think, why is revenge so antithetical to me? Well, it's possible because it's in somewhere where I really would love it if I indulged it. But I don't think I'm a vengeful person, but I may be, and so I didn't get it. And then, however, I did want to work with Steve, and I did want to do it, and God knows I'm glad I did it. But I wished on them something that's never shown up in further productions of it. I wanted to do it about the incursions of the industrial age on society. What happened when we started to put people on the children on the assembly line? What happened when people worked 16 hours a day in a factory and then just went to their hovels to sleep? And what happened when you couldn't breathe clean air, which certainly was true in England. When I first went to England, it was foggy all the time, and very strange to breathe all that in all the time. And it was just the spewing of factories. So I said, I'd like to do it in a factory with Eugene Lee, who very much fed into that. And they heard me. Industrial age, never a part of what they wrote. And they said, do we have to write to accommodate this? And I said, no, you don't have to do a thing. You've got the material. I'll do the factory. And we bought a factory in New Hampshire for $25,000, brought it to New York, disassembled it, of course, and put elements of it, the terrible skylight with soot all over it so you couldn't see the sun, and machines on the stage, machines that must have made something in New Hampshire, but I don't know what they made. For us, everybody'd say, what do they make in that factory? And I said, a musical called Show Boat, smartass. just smartass reply. But I mean, basically, that's what made it possible for me to direct it, and nobody cared. But Steve wrote City on Fire. Well, what merges all those people to City on Fire? So I just found that, I thought, and it's interesting because it has never influenced any further revival of it, and critics have thought they were just great. And then every once in a while, a factory whistle goes off when somebody's murdered, but no one asks, why did a factory whistle go off when somebody's murdered? I would ask that question, but nobody does.
So I loved your original production because it was so huge to see the factory, and then right in the middle, it looked like they were little people stuck in this big industrial world.
And it was a cube, and we just turned the cube around. The show could be done in this theater. It was so small, really. But the only theater available was then called the Eurus and is now called the Gershwin. So we had to take it.
But you made it work beautifully. I thought
Well,
it was
we tried,
really
God
great.
knows.
Throughout your career, how did you find that perfect balance of being both the producer and director without sacrificing one for the other?
Well, because I was a director and had been the producer, I had a staff that took care of a lot of it. And as far as I was concerned, I said to Ruth Mitchell, who was my assistant for 40 years, we were doing She Loves Me, the first one. And the scenic design called for a change of seasons. It's a song about seasons. And the outside of the perfume shop, and we had to go from spring to summer to fall to winter with our cast. And Eugene designed icicles and leaves falling from a tree that magnetically held there, and so on. And so the seasons were wonderfully evocative and marvelous. But I had said to Ruth, if ever I want something and you think I might not need it, ask me whether as a producer I would give it to me. And so she said, wait till you hear this figure. Your 4 seasons are gonna cost $15,000. And do you really need them? And I went to sleep that night, and I came in the next day and said, I really need them. So it was the director prevailing over the producer, and I really needed them. Other times, you don't. And somebody's saying to you, you really need this? No. Do I really need 2 more weeks rehearsal? No. And so on.
I love that. Ruth Mitchell, one of the greatest ladies.
Fabulous creature. And she was my right hand. And I stole her from Jerry Robbins. Jerry brought her in as production stage manager of West Side Story. And she never went back to Jerry. She stayed with me.
How did Evita come about for you, and what unlocked that musical for you?
Andrew Lloyd Webber, I was living in Spain every summer with my family, and he flew over and offered it to me. And he played, the London LSO had recorded the whole thing, London Symphony, and I mean, a full orchestra, 100 people and a chorus and everything. And he played it on a Walkman. And the first number was 200,000 people in front of the Casa Rosada because Eva Peron had died. And I thought, how the hell do you do that on the stage? So I was hooked. So I wrote them a long letter. He went back to London, and I told them all the things I would change. And I got back a letter about a week later saying, you know what, we're doing a concept album. We can't take in everything you wrote in your letter. And so I said to my wife, I guess they don't want me. And a year and a half passed. The concept album came out. It was #1 in Europe. Nothing much in America, where people didn't know who Eva Peron was. But in Europe, everybody did. And one day, my receptionist at the office said, there are 2 young men out here want to see you. And I said, really, who? And she said, well, I don't know. So I looked out, and it was Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, and they brought me the concept album, and they said, now, if you're still interested, we'd like to do it. So I did it. But it was a whole, and then I had a delay because I was doing something else. So it was like 2 years before we actually put it together.
Brilliant musical, everything about it. The filmatic stuff you added in there, I mean, all the film clips danced with everything. Remember, with their hats and everything else. Just beautiful what you did with that show.
Well, Larry Fuller gets marks too. He choreographed all that stuff, and the generals and the oligarchs. And gee, you know, I never heard the word oligarchs until this year, but I'd heard it then. I actually knew what it was way back when. Now it seems to be part of the currency of our language.
You know, you always, I read where you said you have 2 left feet, but your direction is so character-driven and so fluid. So how does someone with 2 left feet do
Well,
what
I
you
don't
do?
dance, do I? No.
I love it. Kiss of a Spider Woman, John Kander, Fred Ebb, Terrence McNally, and of course, the wonderful Cheetah Rivera. What are your fondest memories of that groundbreaking musical?
Oh, it was fun from the get-go. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
We did it. Oh, well, wait a minute. I'm blanking the worst part. We did it in SUNY Purchase with a totally different cast, a totally different script, and it bombed. And the newspapers gave it scabrous reviews. And we took a year and a half off, and then we said, should we revisit this material? Well, what we had done was, I don't want to blame it on him, because Manuel Puig was a great writer. He'd written it originally as a play, and as a book, and then a play. But he told me, and all of us, that he really was infatuated with Rita Hayworth. So we decided to make it about a Rita Hayworth movie star as she imposes her legend on this poor guy in jail. The emphasis was all wrong. A year and a half later, I said, you know, the only way to do this musical is not what we did, which was a Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer musical. We have to do it in a jail. How the hell do you do a whole musical in a jail with those bars all night long? And we figured it out. And a guy named Jerry Serlin made projections that turned the jail magically into another place. But you always knew the jail was there. Yeah. Now, anybody who's seen Prince of Broadway knows that what it answers for me is the same thing, which I love. It opens on a bare stage, it closes on a bare stage, and all night long, we honor Peter Brook's notion of the empty space. We pull something into it and take the bare stage somewhere else. And then we take it away, and you're back to the bare stage. That's what made it all fun to do this show. Yeah. And by the way, ultimately, that's the lesson learned from Kiss the Spider Woman. Also, it didn't hurt that Cheetah Rivera finally played the lead.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes. Parade is one of my all-time favorite musicals, written by Alfred Urey and Jason Robert Brown. What does that musical mean to you?
A lot.
Yeah.
It's about something very serious. My wife said, you know, you walk into the theater and there's a huge tree there, and you know before you go that you're going to see a show about a man who's going to be hanged for a crime he didn't commit. So you sit there and you see this huge tree, and you know eventually, no matter how happy you are during the course of the evening, there's going to be somebody hanging from it. Well, literally, that wasn't what happened, but it was ill-advised. I should have gone softer on all that so that we did invite the audience to maybe the wrong conclusions before the right one came. However, the material's fantastic, the subject's fantastic, and I suppose it's too much to ask of a musical to be that popular when it's about a fellow who did not commit a crime and was paid for it.
Beautiful musical, and your original staging with that tree was absolutely stunning, because like you said, you knew where it was eventually going to go anyway.
Yes.
You know, you never liked during revivals, but you did that glorious production of Show Boat.
That's because I always thought Show Boat was an unbelievable masterpiece, written in 1927, debuted in 1927, and he talks about miscegenation. He talks about all these subjects, and only Oscar Hammerstein could do that. And then he waited until You've Got to Be Carefully Taught in 1949, 22 years later, to go back to that. And then he stayed with it a lot for the shows he wrote subsequently. But I thought the second act was not as good as the first. And I thought because you lost Old Man River, you lost Natchez and the Society, and you also jumped a lot of years in the second act while you watch people grow older. So I thought I could make a better second act of this, and I did. I wrote a couple of montages for Strowman to stage that covered years. So you knew what had happened to our country. And though the second act, most of it takes place in Chicago, our Richard Pilbrow, our lighting designer, had the Mississippi run right across the Chicago street. And subliminally, you kind of got it, yeah. I hope. And so I think we served the original well. And I always thought, because Bill Hammerstein was the family heir to all of this, and he was alive still, and it was his job to protect what his father had written. And I kept making changes. And then and I remember saying, I'm telling you, your father will like this. This is all these years later. And he said, right, well, and but finally we made peace on all these things, and he saw it in front of an audience in Canada, and he was happy. But then after it was a big success on Broadway, he said to me, where did you find the cue to He's Just My Bill? And I said, I didn't find it. He said, well, how did it happen? I thought it must be somewhere in my father's versions. I said, no, I wrote it, actually. And he said, oh. And but basically, she sings He's Just My Bill about a husband named Steve who left her. And so I just wrote a line where she said, this is a song about a guy who once gave me his shoulder to lean on and then took it away. And she says, Bill. So it all kind of made some sense for the audience. But that he caught me. And he did not object.
Beautiful production.
Yeah, I love that show. As it's one of the great American musicals.
My final question is, what is the best bit of advice that you've been given, either personally or professionally, that you live by?
I think the final song in Prince of Broadway says it all. Do the work. And we had a hard time getting that final song because, Jason Robert Brown is a great composer, great lyricist, and he wrote paeans and anthems to, the greater part of creativity and so on. And it didn't smack right. This, just do the work, pal. And he took pal from me. And that's what it is. Just do the work.
Well, I want to tell you, this has been a bucket list for me to sit with you and do an incredible interview with you. And I want to thank you for all the many musicals that you've given all of us and millions of theater goers around the world through your incredible 70-year career.
May I have the last word?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you.
Mr. Harold Prince.